And good morning. My name is Dareth Glantz, and I'm a U.S. Commissioner with the International Joint Commission. I am thrilled to be able to talk about the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement with you all today. And we really want to have good conversations. So we have strategically made our comments very brief. And I'm going to just provide an overview, a high-level overview of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. We're going to hear from John Jackson after me, who has to catch a flight, but will be providing a very important Canadian perspective. And he will talk for as long as he thinks is necessary. Because John has earned that right.
I panicked when you said that.
Do I get that too?
And then we'll be followed, well, because he won't be able to respond to your questions. So John will be anticipating your questions and for our provocative discussion that will follow. And then Catherine Buckner with the Council of Great Lakes Industries will share her thoughts from an industry's perspective in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, followed by Joel Brameyer with the Alliance of the Great Lakes, who will really kind of highlight the opportunities, threats, and weaknesses of the Water Quality Agreement as a tool to drive action through the domestic agenda and help promote public engagement. And then we want to give about 20 or more minutes for discussion. So I'm going to just dive right in, and I want to thank you very much for being here this morning. And I'm going to learn how to do this. So first and foremost, we all come from an incredible place of privilege. And I feel so privileged that I'm able, these are my boys that you're looking at right now, this summer on the shores of Lake Huron in Alcona County in Michigan, able to go up the tributaries, the creek mouths that are flowing directly into the water, pick up algae that I know is not going to make them sick, chase frogs, catch tadpoles, and play in the waves. And the only thing I have to make sure is that they don't drown. So that, I mean, I don't know how I could keep my kids out of water that they aren't supposed to be in. And I think all kids should have this opportunity. I drove 12 hours from my house to do this. I mean, I do go up to Lake Ontario, which is just about an hour away of where I live in Syracuse, New York. But it's just, it's absolutely amazing. So that's my context here for you. Next. And I know how to move these things. Okay, there we go. Nope. Okay. So we're going to talk about the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Again, what you're looking at behind the glorious pictures of Nixon, Trudeau, and Environment Minister Kent and Administrator Jackson, that's the clear, beautiful waters of Lake Huron again. But the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was first signed in 1972. It is built upon the 100-year-old treaty, the Boundary Waters Treaty, that also established the Great Lakes, also established the International Joint Commission. These materials, we have left them for you at the door, and really, I don't know how you live without walking around with these materials with you all the time. It's what I do, and I think you would thoroughly enjoy it. A lot of folk, the Boundary Waters Treaty is often cited as one of the first environmental treaties. It's also an argument as a great peace treaty, but the key provision over 100 years ago was that it is further agreed that the waters herein defined as the boundary waters and waters flowing across the boundary shall not be polluted on either side to the injury or health or the property of the other. So we recognized that in order to be good neighbors between the United States and the Dominion of Canada at the time, that we shouldn't be following each other's waters. And that is the foundation of what the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement is built upon. It was, like I said, adopted in 72, later amended in 78, in 1983, in 1987, and most recently in 2012. So just a real high-level overview of the evolution of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. I'm sure Dave Dempsey probably could write 6 books on this. And but just in 4 sentences or less, really began with a focus on pollution control and chemistry, then evolved to recognizing we needed to take more of an ecosystem approach, began a tighter focus on phosphorus and contaminated sediments, and then recognizing the role of atmospheric deposition as a significant contributor to toxics in the lakes, and then a focus on polluted runoff and near shore water quality. Now, the water quality agreement that we have today is actually a really great read. And I encourage you to read it. It's very well structured and organized. It's very clear and easy to track. And so I encourage you. Well, don't you think it's a good read?
Sure.
Great. Compared to 87? Framers did a great job. So let's kind of talk about the 2012 agreement. And I think it's always important to break rules. And so here's my slide with lots of words on it for you. But in case you did not thoroughly read your water quality agreement before this session, I'm just going to give you the high-level pieces. So based on principles and approaches, and I didn't want to leave any of these out so you can see them, but I think most importantly is there's an accountability mechanism built in. It establishes the Great Lakes Executive Committee. It broadens the tent. And so it's no longer just the federal governments, the state governments. It's also recognizing the role of municipalities, of the tribes, of the First Nations, of the Métis, of the watershed agencies, and the public that are all critical in the fabric of social society to make sure that we achieve the chemical, biological, and physical integrity of the Great Lakes, and that we all need to do this together. So really a lot of focus on coordination, the precautionary principle, public engagement, and the words that you see strangely capitalized are from the text of the agreement. So that's not my capitalization, that's the framers. And recognizing the role of the tributaries, as well as continuing the commitment to zero discharge. So that's principles and approaches. I think it's always important to always begin where you are in the principle. And then there's key objectives. And there's still some seats. Come on in. Don't be shy. This is a very important discussion. Fill on in. And so with our objectives, it is a source of safe, high drinking water quality. So we're talking about a source. So we definitely would like that finished water to be good. It's got to achieve the standards that you have in each of our countries. But the Great Lakes as a whole, the waters of the Great Lakes need to be a high quality source of drinking water, which is very important. We want to allow for swimming and consumption of fish and wildlife without restriction due to environmental damage, support healthy wetlands and habitats to sustain our native species, and be free from pollutants harmful to human health and other organisms, nutrients that promote harmful algal blooms and cyanobacteria growths, introduction and spread of our aquatic and terrestrial invasive species, contaminated groundwater, and the very important catch-all, which is other substances, materials, and conditions that may negatively impact the chemical, physical, and biological integrity. And most importantly, for those of you that have worked on the lake-wide management and action plans in the past, one of the key changes is that those connecting river systems are now part of, are now being worked together. So there will be specific objectives that are developed for each of the lakes and the key rivers that feed into them or out of them. If you're Lake Ontario, you get to the Niagara and the St. Lawrence River. And so implementation. So where we are next year will be the first real triennial meeting of our forum that is hosted by the parties. They did a kickoff. Excellent. We did a kickoff. The parties are the implementers, okay? So the International Joint Commission, we'll talk about what our role is in a minute, but the United States and Canada are responsible for implementing the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and every 3 years, that's another big change in the 2012 agreement, is that we go on a 3-year cycle as opposed to a 2-year cycle, and every 3 years, they host a forum. It's going to be in Toronto, Ontario, the first week of October in 2016, so you should mark your calendars. Should be a good time. And your opportunity to give your feedback on, you'll have other opportunities, but a very important opportunity to give your feedback on how well the parties are progressing towards achieving the goals and objectives of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So they have to progress towards attainment using their best efforts. And this is to really talk about the importance of coordination with states, provinces, local governments, other regulatory agencies on the ground to all align as much as possible to the basic goals and objectives of the Water Quality Agreement. And the agreement is a floor. This is a floor. It is both countries are not limited to go stronger or more stringent, but it provides the basic floor for what is needed for the waters of the Great Lakes. And also the agreement commits the parties to seek appropriation of funds in order to do this work, to enact the necessary legislation. We all know that that can't be done without members of civil society right behind them and demanding it. And then also public input and advice as appropriate. So I'm not sure who determines what that is. And just on the water quality agreement, it's also, there's 10 specific annexes on those key issues that you hold near and dear to your heart. This is a great photo from the Great Lakes Commission meeting last year in Buffalo. You'll see still winds in the background. It's a reclaimed brownfield site. And just, I really like to put pictures of Buffalo in places when I get the opportunity. But really kind of get to the importance of what we're doing with areas of concern. I think another gigantic change that's really important is they used to be lake-wide management plans, and now it's the lake-wide action and management plan that also includes that those rivers. But the term action is in there, and so many of you have participated in these LAMP discussions. The parties are working on figuring out exactly how they want to approach this, and so I've joined the lake-wide, the basin-wide LAMP teleconference, which was very interesting, and the Lake Ontario one. Tomorrow morning, we'll have Catherine and I, along with Chris Korleski and Jill Ryan, we'll have and you, in our closing plenary, we'll explore this even deeper. So I look forward to this conversation kind of teeing that one up for tomorrow. And chemicals of mutual concern, Annex 3 is a little different in its approach of what we've seen in the past, and I expect that there's many people in the audience that will probably have some comments on that as well. But the good news on the annexes is that, it's very clear on what they have to do. There's leads assigned to everybody. There's committees that are formed for every single one of these annexes. There's folks that can serve in observing status. The IJC observes each of the annexes. I believe the Alliance is has observer status on these things as well, so you can know what's happening on these critical issues, provide your input as you get further engaged. And all of these folks are reporting to the Great Lakes Executive Committee, and this will be part of the party's progress report that will tee up that forum in Toronto next year. And I have to talk about what the IJC does now, so I'm going to get through this real quick. So the International Joint Commission was established by the Boundary Waters Treaty. We have activity areas from coast to coast. The bulk of our work is in the Great Lakes, but those beautiful watersheds that you see highlighted are other areas where we have some activities. But a significant amount of work is from the Great Lakes, is in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and focused in the Great Lakes. But we also deal with water levels and diversions, so I'm going to make a plug for you to be familiar with a very important recommendation by the IJC, which is to move forward on modernizing the level and flow regime for Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River, called Plan 2014. So there's fact sheets in the back so you can familiarize yourself with that as well. So the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement assigns specific roles and responsibilities to the IJC. And most importantly, it's to assess the progress of the party. That's great. Thanks, Jen. My time's up, but I'm going to keep going.
Moderator prerogative.
I think I said 10 or 12 minutes. But, so anyway, so we are working very hard to take this very seriously this is the view from our Great Lakes Regional Office in Windsor. We have the best view of Detroit, and especially ice on the river. It's beautiful. But really to assess the progress of the parties under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And we have specific responsibilities to engage the public. So one of the things I'm hopeful that in our discussion, you'll also talk about what you want the IJC to do, what forums you need us to help promote so that we can continue to have these important conversations, and what you want us to do. And we have a dedicated, I have many members of my Science Advisory Board and Water Quality Board in the room. Thank you, John and Jane and others. And we also have some key responsibilities for overall liaison amongst binational institutions, and most importantly, provide advice and recommendations. And so Noah Hall was originally going to be joining us, our esteemed professor out of Wayne State University, but he had court that came up for a pro bono case that he has. And so I did want to include some of his words. So when we're talking about public participation, I'll just leave you with this. Despite legal shortcomings, it's not legally enforceable. It requires domestic action. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement gives citizens an increased role in shaping policy to address transboundary pollution in the Great Lakes through increased opportunity for public participation and decision making. Now, he said that in 2007. We have a new agreement, and I think that's going to be one of the key areas that we'll be focusing on, is if you still feel like that is, if his statement holds true. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Jackson, who's been with the Great Lakes for a long time. And
That's the picture I was talking about.
Sorry, Kat. I thought it was a great picture. You're like in mid-thought. I wanted action pictures of our panelists. Now she's mad at me. I think you look great.
I am going to take that picture off the internet.
It's from Great Lakes Now. Thank you, Great Lakes Now. And so John does have to leave us to go catch a flight, but I really want you to hear from one of our most experienced and esteemed binational Great Lakes citizens on his thoughts from the unique Canadian perspective and his advice moving forward. And then John's going to hand it off to Catherine. Catherine's going to hand it off to Joel, and then we're going to open up the floor to hear from all of you.
Catherine's going to be erasing that picture while I'm talking.
I really liked it, Catherine.
I'm going to look for one of you now, Dareth, and believe me.
There's nothing wrong with that picture, Catherine.
Oh, you're nice.
Thank you, Dareth. It's great to see so many people out and interested in this topic, the standing room only. How many other Canadians are in the room today? Great. Nice to see such a good turnout of Canadians. That's excellent. What I'm going to talk about, first of all, is why the Water Quality Agreement is important, because I often hear from activists, is this a good use of our time, to spend our time on the Water Quality Agreement? And frequently they don't, because domestic programs seem so much more important, and they are important. It's hard to say no. So I'm going to talk about that first, and then talk about an area that I think we need to now, as activists and engaged people, need to focus on now, which is the public engagement component of the new agreement. And so I'll get into that. But why is it important? Well, first of all, I mean, the basic reality that all of us as environmentalists recognize is this is a united ecosystem, all the way from Duluth out to Trois-Rivières, and therefore we have to be working across the border. That's just the reality of the system. And therefore, basic logic tells us we have to be doing binational work. Unfortunately, the Water Quality Agreement doesn't go all the way out to Trois-Rivières in Quebec. It ends at Cornwall-Massena, but that's something we keep pushing for in each renegotiation of the agreement. So it's critically important that we have similar goals, because yes, we can do a great job in the United States in terms of progressing with cleanup, or we can do a great job in some issue in Canada, but unless both sides are working for it, we can't really get where we need to get, because I don't need to say it, the pollution goes back and forth across the border, the water levels go back and forth across the border, the climate change issue, it doesn't recognize the borders. So we have to work binationally, even though I know a lot of people find it frustrating to deal with. So we need at least similar goals, so we're moving towards the same place. We also need, and one of the changes in the new Water Quality Agreement is we also need to have be able to speak to proposals and projects on the other side of the border that are coming up. And most recently, the one that we've seen most action around, certainly throughout Michigan, is the proposal to bury radioactive waste near Lake Huron, not in Lake Huron, near Lake Huron in Ontario, and that proposal. And it's been amazing to see the amount of binational engagement, not just in Michigan, but really through many of the other lakes as well. The Alliance has been working hard on that. I see Dave here from the Great Lakes Cities Initiative working on that, and just grassroots activists working on it. But that's the recognition that what happens on one side affects the other side. So that's a critical component of why we also, and the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement helps pull us together to do that. The other thing is there are programs that have been stimulated and pushed forward that I'm not confident would ever have really developed without it. The areas of concern, and we all have complaints about them. I'm one of the critics of them, but I'm also one of the supporters of them. I've spent a lot of decades working on the cleanup plans because that really came out of the scientists working binationally through the IJC and through the previous water quality agreements, and that designation in the water quality agreement. That really has happened to the extent it did because of that binational Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So we have to really be taking care of that and recognizing the importance of that. The other reason why it's really important for us as activists, people working for change and improvement, to be working binationally across the border is that the opportunities sometimes rise on one side of the border or the other, very often dependent upon what the government is that's in power at the time. And so there are times where we can make a big jump forward on the US side. And for example, the funding recently, the GLRI funding has allowed us to make big progress on the US side. And the Canadian side funding hasn't been that great recently, frankly. But then there have been other, but it helps us to be then pushing on the Canadian side and saying, hold up your end. You've got to hold up your end and keep it moving forward. But then there are times it switches. And I so often have heard people on the US side say, gee, the Canada-Ontario agreement that moves funding from the federal government to Ontario to carry out the things in the water quality agreement. We need something like that on the US side. And it helped actually start that push that got to the GLRI funding, that had that happen. So we sort of take advantages. And at the moment, well, in Canada, we have an election coming later in October. We hope that we can make progress on that election. Who knows where it's going to end? It's a three-way tie at this point. But it may create new opportunities on the Canadian side. And again, the election on the US side, we'll see what happens on that too. Far too early to predict, but hopeful again. But sometimes we have to focus our energies a bit one side or the other. We can play the two governments off of each other and saying, look what the US is doing, or look what Canada's doing. We have to live up to it. So that's another reason why we have to work binationally. We also need to be working together on the water quality agreement to keep an eye on what's going on. For example, at the moment, the Areas of Concern program, they're revising the delisting criteria for what would be defined as a cleaned up area of concern. And one of the things in the new water quality agreement is that you go into a phase of saying, we're in the recovery stage now. And the original proposal was going to be that that would be delisted. You're no longer that negative mark on the map. And on the Canadian side, the people involved, the citizens involved in the cleanup activity said, wait a minute, we're still not clean. We can't say to the public we're clean. We may have done the actions that we need to take, but it still takes time for recovery. So we still have to call it an area of concern. And that effect, when it got into the negotiations on the new water quality agreement, Canada and the US originally had differing positions on that. And the Canadian side won on it, and it's areas of recovery, but there's still areas of concern. I think the final thing that's so important in this is that the Great Lakes are not just an ecosystem, they're also a community. We need to be a binational community. We need the governments working together binationally. The water quality agreements help that happen. But we also, as the activists, the citizens involved, have to really be pushing that binational agreement and that development of the community. That's why meetings like this are so important. I mean, Howe, unfortunately, and I don't mean this negative, but Howe is focused on dealing with US policy, US legislation, and that's critically needed. We need something like that on the Canadian side. But it means that the meetings such as this, for example, aren't really pulling in the Canadian activists as well, and we need that as a community thing. And hopefully in some ways, the IJC can help us do that through their binational meetings. The issue I want to bring out to you now, before departing for the plane, is the one of public involvement. When the agreement was signed 3 years ago, the beginning of this month, one of the things the government stressed as a big change and a big improvement is public engagement and public education and outreach. I have to say that we've actually seen fallbacks rather than improvements in terms of public engagement in those 3 years. And it's so sad to see. And the most blatant thing that really came out so strongly was on the lake-wide management plans, which are now to be, as Dareth said, a more major part of the agreement. A year ago, US EPA announced that they were dropping all funding for these multi-stakeholder committees that were on each of the lakes binational, except in Michigan's case, binational forums, multi-stakeholder committees, meeting on a regular basis, making recommendations, doing outreach into the community, going out into the communities. They were just dropped. And all of them have now, funding's just been dropped. And Canada had dropped funding 3 years earlier. But Canada's much sneakier. They sort of quietly do things. The US announces things. And therefore, the US gets the attention, Canada loves it. Let the negative, and this has been a classic example. They sit there quietly and everyone helps. Hey, Canada, you dropped it earlier. But they quietly let that happen. But the effect is that, and we said, okay, you've announced this. What are you doing instead? You promised public engagement. What are you doing instead? And here we are, a year after that announcement, still no public engagement plan. This summer, we've had 6 webinars, one all the lakes, and the others 5 others for each of the lakes. And there still isn't a plan of what they're going to do. All they keep saying is, no, we won't do the multi-stakeholder committees thing. So how strongly can we believe in the commitment of the federal governments to public engagement when they totally drop the existing mechanisms without having another one in mind and ready to go? The other example is the involvement in each of the annexes. And again, each of them says there will be public involvement in each of them. And the structure that's been set up under each annex is that there's the committee, the subcommittee that's sort of responsible for developing, which is government agencies. And then there are what they call the extended subcommittees. And these are the ones that have people like the Alliance, I'm a member of one of them, on. And each annex is acting very differently. The one on RAPS, they don't have an extended committee with any public involvement at all. I'm on Annex 2, which is the lake-wide management plans. We have full involvement. Every subcommittee meeting, we are all invited to. We're all part of it, full discussions. But the catch is, of course, that there's no power even within those annexes. And so one of the things that came out of the subcommittee, and it wasn't led by the activists that said it, it was led by government agencies saying, we need strong forums, fully funded, multi-stakeholder committees for each of the lakes, and head office in EPA and in Canada, at least Great Lakes head offices said no and dropped it. So there's that issue. You go to the toxics one, and in the toxics one, the extended subcommittee is way over here on the side. They're not part of the subcommittee meetings. They don't often even know what's going on with the rest of the annex. And they've gotten really frustrated in terms of saying, why are we even here? So what I urge you, as I run for the door, before someone here, before she comes gets the net on me, is we need to, as activists, now get out there and binationally working across the border, push and insist on true public engagement, true public involvement. And the idea that sort of we can be 3 years into agreement and still not have engagement says we're not being given the opportunity to form how this agreement's going to be implemented. We're not being there in the formative stage. That's the most important stage for us to be involved. That's what's going to make the difference down the road. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
I got this.
I was going to sit here, though. Is that all right?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll go do that.
Oh, all
I'll
right.
grab my coffee, too.
Joel, can I ask
Sorry
you a
that I
favor?
have to leave everybody.
Please loan me your pen.
It's a last minute invite when no, I couldn't make it.
I won't even use it.
And there'll be lots more discussion on the lab tomorrow morning, too, which is good. So, Catherine.
Okay, thank you. Well, as Dareth said, I'm the president of the Council of Great Lakes Industries, and not surprisingly, I come from a slightly different perspective on the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement than you might have heard from John and Dareth. But just to give you a little context, well, first of all, let me follow John's pattern. Is there anybody else in this room from industry? Okay, did I see one hand from industry? Okay, good to hear it. All right. Welcome. I'm usually at these meetings pretty much on my own, so I appreciate having somebody else who has a business background in it. But just to give you a little context about the Council of Great Lakes Industries, we are an association of large U.S. and Canadian companies that have assets in the Great Lakes region and are interested in sustainable development. And I want to emphasize the interest in sustainable development because it sets us apart a little bit from some other trade associations and industry associations. Our mission is to promote, and this is kind of a quote, and this has been the mission for about 25 years, the economic vitality of the Great Lakes region in harmony with its natural resources. CGLI, before my time even, was an early adopter of the concept of sustainable development as the Brundtland Commission defined it way back when as part of the UN efforts. And we've been around, as I said, for almost 25 years, working on behalf of industry, often, if not usually, under the radar, to ensure that the policies and programs that are emerging here reflect not only the importance of protecting the environment and restoring the water and the other natural resources of the region, but also the importance of jobs and the economy. So that's kind of our goal. So I've been asked today to articulate our reasons for engaging with the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, kind of describe a little bit of on-the-ground stuff of what we do in Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement implementation, and then I have a couple thoughts about, as John suggested, sort of the limitations of the agreement and our obligations as the Great Lakes community to engage. So quite honestly, engaging industry in this table, at this table, or bringing industry to the table can be challenging. And the reason for that is because industry traditionally is reactive. You know, historically, industry has reacted to regulations when they come down the line. And this agreement is before the regulatory policy. It comes before, it sets policies for the region before we even get to regulations that are codified in state laws and regulations. And surprisingly, industry sometimes isn't forward-thinking enough to get involved in those policies. Our members are a slight exception to that simply because they've engaged us, they have engaged with us to kind of help to develop that policy before it comes regulation. It's a little surprising that we have this obstacle because McKinsey did a study in 2013 that said globally as much as 30% of earnings of large corporations can be impacted by regulatory policy before it becomes regulations. That's how much is at stake for industry on the table globally. By getting involved in regulatory policy, they can affect that much of their earnings. That's a big number. So how have we successfully engaged in, or why have we engaged in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement? A couple reasons. They're going to probably seem pretty obvious. One of them is we use a lot of water. Industry uses a lot of water in this region. We take a lot of water out of the lakes and the tributaries. We use it for good purposes to make economic value, and we put it back. We have an impact on water quality in the region, and we know that. And so industry engages with the Water Quality Agreement because there's a real interest in kind of knowing what's happening with the water when it's coming out and the quality of the water coming out. Water quality is very important to industry when it comes out of the source water. For obvious reasons, we need clean water to do what we do if we're incorporating it into a product or using it in a manufacturing process. And of course, we're very heavily regulated in the Great Lakes region as to how we can put it back. So there's a real direct interest in water quality in the industrial community. But I want to go back to this idea of sustainable development because industry also is keenly interested in making sure that environmental and social policy that comes out in the Great Lakes region is in harmony with the economy. This is, you know, we are firm believers that what's good for the water is good for the economy. What's good for the economy is good for the water. And so there's a partnership here between industry and the natural resources and the water quality of the region because it's for the benefit of all. And you know, if you know me, you've heard me say many times, for the good of all, and that's kind of where we are. So how are we currently involved? So I wanted to expand on some of the things that John and Dareth said to give you some on-the-ground ideas of how we have been involved. First of all, we are also an official observer to the Great Lakes Executive Committee, and that may sound like a wonky role. You know, we go to meetings. I do sometimes say I'm a professional meeting attender. But this is actually a fairly meaningful opportunity to provide input to the folks at the high level that are making decisions about how this agreement is being implemented. In our experience, at the end of every Great Lakes Executive Committee meeting, just about, we will either make verbal comments at the meeting, or we will send a letter to the chair folks of the committee and make comments about how the meeting went, where the Great Lakes Executive Committee is going, and makes what we hope are constructive suggestions for improvement. What's interesting here is that we're an observer to a fair number of groups. You don't always get a feedback or response from the folks that are charged with the responsibility for implementing the program. We almost always get a response from the co-chairs or one of their staff that is a meaningful response to our suggestions and our comments. So although that may sound like an empty exercise, so far we haven't viewed it as an empty exercise. We feel that we are able to impact the program through those observer comments and by serving as an observer. As John suggested, although he pointed to me, I don't think he really said this, we are deeply involved with the Annex 3 process. Annex 3, to remind you, is the chemicals of mutual concern. This is a roll your sleeves up kind of work. My colleague, Dale Fennessy, is on the extended subcommittee for that. There is certainly some frustration around the Annex 3 work because it is a new program, a relatively new program in the region. The extended subcommittee and the subcommittee is working on everything from, how are we going to get this program started to actually reviewing specific chemicals to determine if they should be chemicals of mutual concern. And we as an organization are involved in that process. In that role, Dale attends meetings of the extended subcommittee. He has input. Again, he writes letters. He talks directly with the folks that are putting that program together in an attempt to make sure that it reflects some of our principles of operation, which have to do with making sure our decisions are based in science, based in data, based on sound, peer-reviewed information, and are inclusive of all stakeholder views. So that's kind of our general perspective on that. In addition to that, members of our chemical management work group have actually been part of the identification task teams. Again, this is roll your sleeves up kind of stuff, where they're looking at toxicological data. They're looking at reports about the concentrations of chemicals in the Great Lakes to determine, are the management programs here sufficient to manage those chemicals? Do we need additional management programs? And then the next step, of course, will be, what would they be? So this is pretty deep involvement by a stakeholder in the implementation of a very, very important program. And of course, CGLI has a long history of being involved in toxics programs in the region. And so there's some experience amongst our membership, and certainly with Dale, in those efforts. And then third, like many people, and John made a very clear call to action on this, we are looking for opportunities to engage in lake-wide action and management plans in the Annex 2 process. This is a unique opportunity for Great Lakes stakeholders to take a look at a lake and say, what do we want for that lake? What do we need for that lake? And how are we going to look at it as a whole ecosystem? The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement is an ecosystem approach for the region. This is an opportunity to get involved on a lake-wide basis, and we are looking for those opportunities. If you come to the plenary panel tomorrow, you might hear a few obstacles on those opportunities and suggestions for how we can make that more impactful and more effective. But we're looking for those opportunities to be involved.
So we're running tight.
I know, I'm sorry.
Okay.
So here are my last thoughts. Here's one of the key reasons why I think we are involved and that we all need to get involved in the implementation of the agreement. As I said, and as John said and Dara said, this agreement is the vision for the Great Lakes. It is an ecosystem approach to managing Great Lakes issues. It has evolved substantially over the years to really touch on the key ecosystem stressors, going from a very focused toxics and nutrients program to really what do we need to know about the Great Lakes ecosystem. But it is not enforceable. I come from this from a slightly different perspective because I'm an attorney, and I looked at this agreement and I thought, these are general principles, great, but there is not an action plan here. It is the responsibility of the Great Lakes Executive Committee, the committees, the extended subcommittees, the extended subcommittees, and the extended subcommittees to create that action plan, to make the vision for the Great Lakes actionable on the ground. And because of the breadth of the agreement, the stakeholder community has also expanded. And it really requires all of us to come to this table, find ways to come to this table, funded or not funded, in order to make this agreement actionable on the ground. Because standing alone, it's not going to do what it says. So I'll leave that there. Sorry, I took too much time. Thanks for the time.
We all did. You get started, and it's much better.
I know.
Take it away, Joel.
All right, so I don't think I have to say anything after that. I'll keep it short. I do encourage you. I did actually go back and read this.
I did too.
Good.
Prior to the presentation today. If you haven't actually read the agreement, somebody did pay attention to the narrative when this was being composed. So for a bureaucratic document, it's not a bad read. So I do encourage you to do so. I'll try not to repeat anything that's already been said and get through my comments quickly. I also need to pull the mic closer. All right. So I think Dareth and others have done a good job of talking about what the agreement is and what it's not. And the thrust of my comments is going to be, let the agreement be what it is, support it for that, take advantage of that. Don't expect it to be something it's not. And I'll talk a little bit about other places where we can use the agreement to make progress in the Great Lakes. So one of the great things about the agreement is that it's something that can actually persist beyond political administrations. I'm a big believer in grand pronouncements and commitments from elected officials that they are going to do something within the next 2 years, 5 years. Not because I always know that person is going to be able to do that, but because it creates a moment in time that a community of people can actually grab hold of that commitment and elevate it to something that can drive change across political administrations. And I really do believe that the agreement can do that. If you dig into some of the general objectives of the agreement, I looked for the places where Dareth asked me to talk about domestic implementation. So I looked into the places in the agreement where you actually see language that either is at par with or even supersedes what we see in federal law. Things like statements like recreation unrestricted by environmental quality concerns, consumption of fish and wildlife unrestricted by harmful pollutants, free from nutrients that interfere with aquatic health and human use. Free from. I mean, these are statements directly from the agreement. Those are aspirational objectives in there, but they are very real. They're in black and white. And it's up to everybody in this room and many others to grab hold of them and do something with them. There's also a great commitment to accountability within the agreement that I'll talk about in a couple of moments, and maybe not quite in the way that we usually think about it. So after I did that, I kind of started thinking, well, what are the most important annexes in the agreement by my read? Because frankly, we can't prioritize all 10 of them at once. And do those annexes actually live up to those aspirational statements that are at the front of the agreement? The ones I'm going to choose to focus on are, not surprisingly, annexes 2, 3, and 4, which are the lamps, chemicals of mutual concern, and nutrients. I happen to think those are the places where we have the most potential to make progress under the agreement. I also think that each of those annexes falls short currently of those aspirational statements that are at the front of the document. And we'll talk more about this in the discussion, I'm sure. So for Annex 2, for the lake-wide management plans, the process of how to get there, how to write these plans has been laid out. What hasn't been laid out is what are the actual objectives for the individual lake basins that we're trying to attain. And that's going to be the responsibility of the committees formed around these lake ecosystem objectives. Of concern is that it's not clear at all yet, as John mentioned, how the public is going to be involved with and contribute to the implementation of those objectives. So we've got some work to do there on the domestic side. I think that the Annex 3, Catherine and I see this a little bit differently, but I think on Annex 3, it's been a great process for building agreement between the parties themselves on chemicals of mutual concern. I think the agreement really has fallen short, particularly on using Annex 3 to identify chemicals of emerging concern. I feel like there's a little bit of treading water going on domestically, and we're not actually exploring the full potential of that annex as a way to anticipate what might be coming down the line and causing problems in the Great Lakes. And finally, Annex 4, the one that everybody's paying the most attention to because it has to do with protecting the quality of our drinking water. And this is the one where it has the most specific targets and goals laid out of any of the 10 annexes that I see, with the exception perhaps of the areas of concern. But we're still relying on the actions and work being done by both the IJC and the work of the states and provinces to really drive what's possible under Annex 4. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm actually optimistic that we're going to not only meet but beat some of the targets that are in that annex because of the hard work that's happening on the domestic side at the state and provincial level. So the big question is, I think, and somebody posed this, it might have been you, Dareth, today already, is where should the greater Great Lakes community spend its time with regard to the water quality agreement. And I was inspired by John's spirited call to arms to really squeeze as much potential out of this from every corner of the Great Lakes as we can. And I agree with that. I want everybody to remember that every domestic agency that's working to implement the agreement is working under an existing legal mandate and an existing source of funding that's driving what they do. They are not working primarily to implement the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And so you really need to understand when you're seeing actions that are being taken, are they fulfilling the aims of the agreement, or are they being driven by other mandates and other funding and being conformed into the process of the agreement? And there's ways to work through both of those kinds of approaches that can be productive. I also wanted to point out that the International Joint Commission and Dareth and her associated commissioners have done some really fantastic work over the last several years, particularly on the Lake Erie issue. And it's an illustration of the power of the commission when it comes to accountability. Built into the agreement is not only self-reporting by the parties on the work that they're doing to implement, but there's also effectively third-party accountability. And it's one of the only places I can think of in the Great Lakes where you have real substantive, scientifically credible, well-funded research that is going to go toward determining whether or not the parties are achieving the goals of the agreement. And keep in mind that the agreement is a layer of policy between the IJC and domestic implementation. So when the IJC talks about accountability for the water quality agreement, they're also really talking about accountability for the success of domestic policy. And that is something that we all need to pay very close attention to as the IJC continues its work to determine progress under the agreement. The last thing I'll say is just to echo the concerns about public engagement. I do share John's skepticism of the party's commitment to public engagement. I don't know that, I actually am going to withhold comment on the forums in particular because there is a lot of baggage there. But I do want to nuance what John said a little bit more. We have to choose our spots with the agreement and domestic policy. There is not unlimited capacity for stakeholders to engage on this work. And we've really got to determine where is that capacity best applied to have the most impact on the implementation of the agreement. That may be working on the agreement itself. It may be working with some of the domestic policies, and I guarantee that it is, that shape the outcomes in the agreement before that level of binational coordination ever happens. They're both extremely important. And I look forward to tomorrow's conversation where we can dig into a little more depth on those questions of public engagement. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Joel.
Sure.
So we want to open it up to you. I intended for us to have more time, but there's never enough time. Your comments made me, and thank you very much, Catherine and Joel. And I kept thinking about, how many different tributaries all go into one big lake. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about in terms of policy making. But I get to play Oprah now. I want to hear from you all. And so please ask questions and I have a mic so that we can hear you, and I'm going to keep walking, and I'm shocked. Dave.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. A question for you, Catherine. First of all, I was very pleased to hear that you give feedback on each of the Great Lakes Executive Committee meetings and that you get a response to it. My question is, have any of the suggestions that you've made to improve the operations actually been implemented?
With the Great Lakes Executive Committee,
A little closer to the mic, please, Catherine.
Sorry, yeah.
Yep.
With the Great Lakes Executive Committee, we had our most, I won't say critical, but our most detailed set of suggestions after the last Great Lakes Executive Committee. Okay, and I might say that some of these are not like earth-shattering. I mean, some of our suggestions are, why are we reading the agreement provisions at every meeting? Let's spend more time at the meeting talking and discussing things and having meaningful exchange rather than having a presentation of the parties. And I received a response from both Mike Goffin, that's a member, Mike Goffin at Environment Canada, and Chris Korleski at US EPA that said, thank you very much for your comment. We're going to try to incorporate that suggestion into our future meeting schedule. The suggestion being really at its core, let's have more conversation. Let's have more exchange at these meetings. To give you an idea, I took a picture of one of these meetings and I put it on I showed it to one of my member meetings. This is a large group of people that runs this agreement. This is a room full of very well-intentioned, very intelligent people, and there isn't a lot of time in a two-day meeting for exchange. So we need to make those opportunities, I said, to have meaningful exchange. That's the kind of response that I get, and I believe that some of these comments will be incorporated, and if not, we're going to just keep pushing. CGLI has a history of putting its elbows out and getting itself into environments and in fora that we feel are important, and we'll continue to do that. For the Annex 3 work, as John suggested, it's been a little more, it's been a little looser, a little more frustrating. Maybe there hasn't been as much, at least with me, now Dale my colleague may have a different opinion, a direct exchange of here's my idea and here's how we might respond. But we still feel that Annex 3 work is incredibly important in order to establish a process that is solid, that is, and defensible, and is enduring for evaluating chemicals in the Great Lakes region. I will not count, Joel and I do see things differently on the Annex 3 work. If I could take one additional moment, I just wanted to say, we frequently say in the Great Lakes region that we speak with one voice, and I think that truly, to the external community, we often do speak with one voice. The fact is, there are many voices here in the Great Lakes region, and from our perspective, we always believe that the more voices that are in the conversation, the stronger the policy. So we differ, Joel, but we work hard to come up with a consensus that is for the good of all. Sorry.
Excellent. Joel,
Editorial
did you want
comment.
anything to add, or do you want to just keep going?
Keep questions coming, or comments.
So I'm delighted that they get back to you. I've never actually had a written response to any of my comments about the water quality agreement in the last 7 years, which says to me, in part, the GLEC process, the Great Lakes Executive Committee process, seems to me very internal. It's the agencies, it's the domestic leaders, and if you have funding to get to those meetings, I assume they're public and open. But by and large, it's very difficult to insert yourself into that process because the room is already quite full, as you noted. And part of what troubles me is these committees are making these decisions in ways that are very difficult for the public to engage in and access. I tried to get on the website the other day to figure out who was on one of these extended subcommittees. I couldn't even find a list, and I was pretty tenacious about it, but time moved on. And so I think, as we explore, how do we make things transparent? How do we make them accessible? How do we provide funding for people who don't have jobs that support them to engage? Annex 3 is pretty near and dear to my exasperated heart on toxics, and I find it impenetrable and frustrating, and there's a blog post on it today called The Power of Lists. You can Google that. But it strikes me very frustrating that we have to go to things like blog pieces to get comments into a system that seems very opaque at this point. And I realize the decision makers are not at the table, but I just wanted to get that on the record.
So just for that, and then you may have something else, but you can listen to webinars for the GLEC meetings. There's usually a WebEx, so you can see the PowerPoint presentations. They send it out on Glyn, which I imagine most of you are on. Thank you, Great Lakes Commission, for funding that resource. And but I think there's some real core issues of transparency, which folks always say it's really easy to say and it's harder to do. And I take that, but there's definitely ways to participate without spending a lot of money. I think we've also seen more observers be recognized. So I think if folks ask for official observer status, it's typically granted. So the world's run by those that show up, I think, too. And so if you feel like you've been blocked, I think there's, that's very important for us to know. But I think there are opportunities for folks to get involved in a relatively low-cost way, although it is more people talking at you.
Yeah, let me
go ahead,
Jane. A quick comment on that point about talking at you. I know that one of the so I'm on the LAMP extended subcommittee, Annex 2 extended subcommittee, and I have repeatedly made points about the importance of having stakeholders involved, not just to hear what's happening, but actually to be involved in implementation of the work. And what I get back frequently is a sense of significant discomfort with the idea of committing to anything that goes beyond what the parties can directly control in their implementation. And I think that's a real concern to me, because what it means is that we're missing out on a chance to actually work with stakeholders who have the power to implement and support implementation in a way that I think showed its success really well in the Great Lakes Regional Collaboration in 2005, which was a very broad process and led to a lot of support and implementation action several years down the road. And I'm sure there's other examples too, but that's a place where I think we continue to need to push.
Great, thank you. So we've heard the theme that public engagement is a central component of the water quality agreement, both in the objectives and in each annex, but it's not clear how public engagement is going to be carried out in each annex and if that's consistent across each annex. So given that, we've heard some concerns about public engagement so far. Specifically in Annex 2, we have lake ecosystem objectives and a nearshore framework in draft form without that public engagement. Is there a role for the IJC to come in and offer some recommendations and kind of give an assessment of public engagement to date?
I think that is our role. We were given a role of providing advice and recommendations in our triennial assessment of progress, and we will be doing extensive public outreach to receive that advice, because it doesn't come just in Windsor, in our office. It comes talking and engaging to people, so I think that's really important. So I think that's one of the unique things with the agreement is there's another avenue. So if you don't feel like you can move forward through the domestic agencies, we have this almost a role of a passing judgment on the implementation of the agreement. So please put pressure on the IJC. I think that's very important as well. And yes, I'm going to stop now. Tomorrow morning will be very interesting.
Very quickly,
yes.
Adam, and I know you'll understand this. The point I was trying to make in my comments, and maybe it didn't come through totally clearly, is that public engagement on domestic policy is engagement on the water quality agreement, because those decisions are driving what actually gets into the lake ecosystem objectives. So that's what I meant by trying to play all sides.
Well, I'm going to go to Lyman before.
Just a quick response.
Oh, okay.
Just so people are aware, and Jane would be as well, that the Great Lakes Water Quality Board is specifically looking at improving public engagement. So if you have any specific suggestions, the Water Quality Board is totally open to them. Thank you.
Dave Ulrich, in one of his many hats, is also the chair, the U.S. chair of the IJC's Great Lakes Water Quality Board. Lyman, there you are.
Thanks. I'd like to address this public engagement and get some feedback. I think this is critically important. So from the industry standpoint, I think it's great that you're able to provide comments at the GLEC meetings and get a response. I'm wondering, though, at the annex level, let's say Annex 4, we recently submitted comments on nutrient targets. Do you think it's appropriate for responses to come back to the public and people that provided comments? Is that an appropriate way? And also on LAMP development, we're supposed to be, under the agreement, by this year, having a Lake Superior LAMP completed. Where's the public engagement and participation in that? What's the appropriate, from the industry side, I'm really interested in wondering, what do you think the appropriate level of engagement and response from the United States and Canada, and also what the IJC could do to facilitate that?
Well, first of all, I feel I've maybe thrown the GLEC under the bus a little bit here by saying we got a response, and I'm surprised to hear other people haven't. I was not aware that other people weren't getting a response. I don't see any reason why industry wouldn't support responses for everybody if there were time to do so. I will say that in our comments, first of all, I think I have already made the point. We're fairly unusual at some of these meetings as the industry perspective. We are also very specific in terms. We try to be very specific in terms of our ask. We say, we suggest this, and it could be something like, give us a handout at the beginning that shows the main provisions of the water quality agreement so we don't have to discuss them at every meeting. We make specific suggestions about, about how maybe to create the unholy bureaucracy in order to get more engagement for people. And so maybe it's easier to respond, I don't know. And I'm not suggesting, you know, that the Great Lakes Executive Committee should spend all its time responding to public comments. I guess I should feel honored that we've received some responses. But as far as public engagement, we wholeheartedly support public engagement in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement implementation because, as I said, the more voices, the better policy. And we really believe that. I mean, I think that is something CGLI was founded on almost 25 years ago and has been an operating principle, inclusive, science-based, data-based, analytical, you know, policy development is what we're about. So Lyman, we would suggest that everybody should have responses and be able to have meaningful engagement. I think that's the goal.
So I just want to raise that, you know, and this is more of a pitch for tomorrow. US EPA has committed to a new approach to engaging the public, a facilitated engagement with stakeholders around the agreement, which some of you have heard about on these webinars that have been going on recently. The jury's still out on how that's going to develop, and I know Chris Korleski is hopefully going to go into more detail about that tomorrow morning. So I encourage you to go there, ask Chris questions like that, and see if it measures up to the response that you're expecting.
Go ahead.
Okay. My name's Jill Crafton. I'm part of a watershed district in Minnesota, and we're taking a look more at groundwater issues. And our aquifers in Minnesota have been depleting, and a lot of it's business and individuals, so you know, across the spectrum. But I wondered if there's an update on kind of what the focus is for the annex for groundwater, and just wondered if I mean, there is a pact for that to lakes, so I just wondered what the information was on that.
So there's an annex on groundwater. Norm is not here, so I don't think I can answer your question on groundwater, but Norm Graham with the USGS is the best guy to talk to about groundwater in the Great Lakes in the U.S. side. I believe are we done? So I think they're going to kick us out. And again, this is just your primer for tomorrow morning for the plenary discussion. Please continue this discussion. Please thank Catherine and Joel. Thank you so much. I appreciate y'all being here. And I think, Adam, I'm going to go back to your question. You know, again, I think one of the key things is public engagement as appropriate. That as appropriate is not defined in the agreement, and I think it's up to the people in the room to decide what is appropriate and what isn't. So I appreciate your continued engagement. Have a good rest of your day.